The first time she told someone she was moving her grandmother out of the care facility, their face dropped, like she'd just confessed to burning down her future. "Why would you ruin your life like that?" they asked. And in that moment, she understood something. They didn't see her grandmother anymore. They only saw inconvenience. It hadn't always been this way. Her grandmother had once been the center of every family gathering. Her laugh, boisterous, crackling, had once filled rooms, coaxed smiles out of the most bitter of aunts. But that version of her was long gone, replaced by a woman who spoke in fragments and sometimes mistook her own granddaughter for her sister or a nurse. After the stroke, the family had made a decision without consulting her. The grandmother would be placed in a private hospital wing. Best care possible, they had said. Professional help, clean, quiet. What they hadn't said, what they hadn't needed to say, was that they were washing their hands of it. When she first walked into that sterile room with the plastic recliner and the television mounted too high to see, something in her cracked open. Her grandmother, eyes unfocused, hands restless, seemed less like a patient and more like a ghost still waiting to leave. She reached out to hold her hand, but her grandmother didn't react. Still, she didn't pull away. That was all she needed. No discussion, no family vote, no begging for approval. She signed the discharge forms and brought her grandmother home that night. The apartment was small, barely one bedroom, but it had windows, wide ones that opened out to a modest sprawl of trees that caught fire in the fall. She laid an old mattress on the floor next to her own bed and told herself she'd figure out the rest. The truth was, she already knew. There was no plan, only presence. At first, it was chaos. Her grandmother wandered at night. She'd forget where the bathroom was and urinate in the corner. She refused to eat unless she could touch the plate first. She was convinced, for a full week, that her granddaughter was trying to poison her with rice. But slowly, rhythms emerged, gentle anchors in an otherwise drifting sea. They started listening to the radio, stations that played the old crooners her grandmother used to sing along with when cooking Sunday dinner. She began preparing soft, simple meals: vegetable soup, toast, sliced pears with cinnamon. Sometimes they ate together in silence. Other times, her grandmother would mumble stories that made no linear sense but were filled with names, places, snippets of memories she clung to like threadbare photographs. One day, without prompting, her grandmother laughed. At nothing, just laughed. She laughed too, and something shifted. The world outside did not pause to admire her sacrifice. Her friends, once frequent dinner companions, stopped inviting her out. When she tried explaining, they blinked, unsure what to say. "Couldn't you hire someone? Doesn't Medicare cover that? You're too young for this kind of thing." Her career stalled. Projects she had dreamed of pursuing were shelved in favor of hourly remote work she could do while her grandmother napped. Her parents didn't even pretend to understand. They stopped calling. Her brother said, "You're acting like a martyr. No one asked you to do this." No one had. But every morning, she helped her grandmother dress. She washed her hair. She sat with her through the paranoia, the fear, the blankness. And when the spark returned, even for a second, she was there to catch it. Not because it was easy, not even because it was expected, but because it was right. This wasn't some fairy tale of redemption. This was messy, exhausting, often thankless. She cried in the bathroom more than once, silently, so her grandmother wouldn't hear. She Googled late-night forums for caregivers and bookmarked articles on burnout. But she also learned something else. Care is not transaction. It's not owed. It's not weighed and measured against career prospects or social calendars. It is a choice, one she made every single morning. Eventually, the time came when her grandmother no longer recognized her at all. She would look at her with vacant eyes and ask, "Where's my granddaughter?" She used to visit. At first, it cut like a blade, but then she found a strange peace in it. She would answer, "She'll be here soon," and sit beside her anyway. What mattered was not that she was remembered. What mattered was that she was there. People said she was losing herself, that she was isolating, that she was throwing away the best years of her life. But in truth, she had never felt more herself. For the first time, her days were not dictated by ambition or expectation. She lived slowly, deliberately. She found meaning in the way the sunlight filtered through the trees, in the softness of a wool blanket, in the way her grandmother's fingers curled around hers at night, like a child seeking comfort. She did not call her family when death came. She did not inform them. They had made their choice in favor of control, reputation, and profit. She had made hers in favor of presence. When the end arrived, it wasn't loud. It wasn't cinematic. There were no gasping last words, just a gentle stillness, a final breath, a hand held until the very end. No letters, no drama, but she didn't need any of that, because what they had wasn't about final acts. It was about all the small ones that came before. The next morning, she woke up alone in the apartment. She brewed coffee, watched the leaves outside. There was no eulogy, no ceremony, only her and the quiet, and a peace so deep it felt like love had settled into her bones. She didn't feel noble or brave. She felt whole. She had chosen not to abandon someone when they became inconvenient. She had chosen to stay when everyone else left. And in doing so, she had not just cared for her grandmother, she had rescued the part of herself that believed in care, in loyalty, in presence over performance, even if no one else ever saw it, even if the world called it a waste. The hardest part wasn't death, it was everything that came after. Because once her grandmother was gone, once the quiet settled, and there was no hand to hold, no soft mumbling in the dark, she thought maybe, her family would return, that someone, even out of obligation, would call, ask if she was okay, send a card, show up. They didn't, not a single one. The same people who had once said, she's better off in a home, now offered no comfort, no presence, not even the cold charity of a voicemail. They had made their judgment years ago, that she was foolish for derailing her life, for sinking into the burden of caretaking, that she had done this to herself, and that meant, by their rules, she didn't deserve their sympathy. She was a cautionary tale now. Her mother's last words to her, before she stopped answering texts altogether, had been, "You think love is enough, but love doesn't pay the rent." Funny how no one asked how she did pay the rent all this time, how she worked nights doing freelance transcription, how she sold her grandmother's old jewelry, not for cash, but to cover the deposit on the medical equipment, how she gave up everything they valued, parties, promotions, even dating. Her father hadn't even bothered to speak to her directly. He left a comment on her Facebook post, wishing you strength, like she was a stranger grieving a distant loss, not his own daughter, who had become a hospice worker in her own home. She often thought about what the word family really meant, whether it was blood, proximity, or something else. The people who had hurt her the least during this time were strangers. A kind nurse from the hospital, who gave her tips on how to gently reorient someone with memory loss. The neighbor who brought over soup in the dead of winter, saying only, "It's not much, but I remember when I looked after my dad." A barista who noticed her coming in at the same time every Thursday and eventually memorized her order. Meanwhile, her own brother sent a single text after their grandmother's death. "You should have told us." She was ours too. She didn't reply. She couldn't, because no, she wasn't theirs anymore. Not after they had abandoned her to die in a place filled with beeping machines and the stench of antiseptic, and no one who remembered the name of her first pet or how she liked her eggs. Not after they made her into a problem to be solved instead of a person to be loved. If they had truly cared, they would have come before the funeral, not for closure, but for presence. What surprised her most was the guilt that followed, not theirs, hers. She had expected grief, expected loneliness, but she hadn't expected guilt to creep in like a draft under a sealed window. Because now that it was over, she had time, space, freedom, and she didn't know what to do with it. She would lie awake some nights, curled under the same blanket they had shared, and feel waves of something like betrayal wash over her. Could she smile again? Could she go to a restaurant and not feel like she had to hurry home to check on someone? Could she meet someone new, fall in love, travel, and not feel like she had abandoned something sacred? The rituals she had formed, brushing another's hair, chopping vegetables slowly, waiting through confused silences, had changed her. She could no longer rush through things, could no longer treat time as currency. She had become someone else, someone her family no longer recognized, maybe someone no one recognized. She started journaling again, not about her grandmother, but about herself, or at least the self she was trying to rediscover. In one entry, she wrote, "I thought caregiving was a loss, but it was actually a return. The person I became in that room, quiet, patient, unyielding, is the most real version of me I've ever met. She doesn't need applause. She just needs peace." It felt like a small rebellion, to write not of pain, but of growth, because the truth was, despite everything she had lost, friends, plans, certainty, she had also gained something sacred, something the world seemed to forget how to value, the dignity of staying. Sometimes she would wonder fleetingly if her grandmother had truly known it was her there at the end. She'd heard stories, miraculous ones, of people regaining clarity just before death, of one last moment of lucidity. That didn't happen. There were no whispered names, no "I love yous," only a slow breathing, then stillness. But she didn't need a miracle to know what they had shared, because love is not measured by recognition. It's measured by repetition, by the hands that changed bedsheets again and again, by the spoon raised patiently to waiting lips, by the silence that was sat with, not filled. A few months later, a distant cousin reached out, asking if she would attend a family wedding. She declined, not with anger, but with clarity. They had chosen absence. She had chosen presence. She didn't need to perform belonging anymore. Sometimes, late at night, she would sit on the balcony of the apartment and close her eyes, imagining her grandmother sitting beside her in the old chair they'd found on the curb and refurbished together. She would remember her laugh, not the real one, the big one from before the stroke, but the shadow of it, the one that came unbidden in those final months, like muscle memory. She didn't cry when she remembered. She smiled, because what she had given was never wasted, even if the world would never see it as success, even if her family thought she had lost. She had lived a truth they couldn't bear to touch. For the first few weeks after her grandmother's death, she didn't rearrange anything. The bed stayed on the floor. The extra chair remained by the window. Her grandmother's robe hung from the bathroom hook like a silent witness. She wasn't ready to clear it out, and not because she was sentimental, but because the space, however sparse, had been shaped by presence. The furniture had weight now, memory, purpose. She wasn't ready to live in a home that had no echoes. Still, the world, uncaring, marched on. Rent came due, groceries spoiled, emails piled up. Her body, thin from months of missed meals and broken sleep, demanded attention. She couldn't ignore it anymore. Life, even the kind that had paused for grief, required re-entry. So she began with something small. She signed up for a ceramics class. The room smelled like wet clay and lemon sanitizer, and the people there were all different ages. Most came in pairs. She came alone. She liked that. There were no expectations. No one asked where she'd been or who she had lost. There was something healing in the slowness of shaping something new with her hands. She didn't have to speak, only press, pinch, smooth. The silence wasn't painful anymore. It was generous. For once, she didn't have to explain herself to anyone. She didn't talk about her grandmother. Not yet. The grief sat in her, heavy but quiet, like a stone at the bottom of a lake. Always there. Sometimes the ripples reached the surface, sometimes not. It wasn't depression. It was disorientation. People asked how she was doing now that she was free. She never knew how to answer that. What kind of freedom was it when you'd given your heart to someone and watched it fade from their eyes? She was free the way a tree is free after a storm has stripped it bare. Still standing, yes, but missing something essential. Her first dinner out was with a woman she met at the class, Elena, soft-voiced and sharp-eyed, who mentioned, in passing, that she'd lost her partner the year before. Cancer. Quick and cruel. They didn't talk about it in detail. That was what made the connection possible. There was a shared language in the way they paused before speaking, how they noticed each other's silences more than words. They understood that grief isn't loud. It's not always sobbing or absence. Sometimes, it's just sitting in a restaurant and not knowing if you're supposed to enjoy the food. She took a bite of her pasta and forced herself to chew. And when she smiled at Elena, it wasn't fake. It wasn't full, either, but it was real. Of course, the guilt came too. Happiness felt like betrayal, not of her grandmother, but of that younger version of herself who had spent so many nights curled on the floor, whispering lullabies to someone who no longer remembered her name. That version of her had lived without dreams, without longing. She had given all of herself. Now she was dreaming again, of color, of movement, of music in the mornings and long walks by the river with no destination. And it felt like cheating. Who was she, if not the one who stayed behind? If not the caregiver? What was her identity now, if not defined by sacrifice? She caught herself laughing once. Real, open laughter, at something someone said in class, and it struck her like a slap. She didn't recognize the sound. For a moment, she froze. Her first instinct was to apologize. But to whom? Her grandmother was gone. Her family didn't care. And the world was not keeping score. It was only her, deciding whether or not she was allowed to heal. She stopped explaining herself, stopped calling people who only called out of obligation. She deleted photos from her phone, not of her grandmother, but of the people who had vanished when things got hard. The ones who told her she was being too dramatic when she cried at losing a night's sleep. The ones who offered advice instead of presence. Her contact list shrank. Her sense of self grew. Elena introduced her to a small grief circle that met at the library on Thursdays. She almost didn't go. She stood at the door twice and left before walking in. The third time, she stepped inside. No one hugged her. No one asked her name right away. She sat in a circle of strangers, most of them older, some younger, and listened. That first night, she said only 3 words. She died quietly. But when she got home, she slept better than she had in weeks. She began writing again. Not journals this time, but stories, fragments of things, little vignettes about caretakers and silences, about mornings that smelled like toast, and the radio humming softly. She didn't know if they were good, but they were honest. Some she emailed to herself, some she burned. She was learning not everything needed to be kept. Some things could simply exist, briefly, and still matter. One afternoon, walking home past a park, she saw a child fall. His mother rushed to him, soothed him, checked for scrapes. The boy wasn't seriously hurt, just startled, but his cry was loud, piercing, and his mother rocked him without words. And the woman felt a tear slip down her own cheek, not from sadness, but from recognition. That's what it meant to be seen, to be held, even when the wound was invisible. She hadn't had that when her world was crumbling, but she had become that. She had become the kind of person who stayed through the cry, who didn't look away, who knew that healing wasn't about fixing, but witnessing. That was her quiet strength, not in rebuilding fast, not in bouncing back, but in walking deliberately through the wreckage and planting something small where the fire had been. Her grief didn't disappear, it just softened its shape. And now, finally, so did she. The call came on a rainy Wednesday, not a storm, just that soft, persistent drizzle that soaks the city in grayscale. It was her brother. She stared at the name on the screen, uncertain whether to answer. It had been nearly a year since their last conversation, short, obligatory, laced with avoidance. When she finally picked up, he sounded breathless, like he'd been rehearsing for days. "I was cleaning out Mom's garage," he said, without preamble, "and I found a box. Her old letters. Some from Grandma, some about her." She didn't speak, just listened. She wrote about you. A lot more than I thought." His voice cracked, just slightly. "I think I didn't want to know. That's on me." There was a pause. Not an apology, but maybe a beginning. Later that evening, she sat alone with a mug of tea and thought about legacy. Not the kind etched in headstones or heirlooms, but the kind that lives in small rituals. The way she now hummed to herself when stirring soup, just like her grandmother used to. The way she folded laundry with care. The way she answered the phone softly, knowing that some calls don't return. She didn't need her family's absolution, but she had made peace with the fact that some wounds wouldn't scar cleanly. Some would ache forever, but she could live around the ache. She had not just cared for her grandmother. She had embodied care, and now it lived on in her fingertips, her tone, her stillness. It had shaped her in ways that no one could take back. Not even silence, not even distance. She never did return to her old friend group, Too many of them wanted the version of her that had once stayed out late, laughed freely, wore heels and ambition like armor. That woman still existed, somewhere, but she was quieter now, less interested in performance, more interested in truth. And the truth was, joy looked different now. It came in odd places. A stranger holding the door without rushing her. A blooming plant she thought she'd killed. A letter in her mailbox from someone in the grief circle, saying simply, "Thank you for sitting next to me." She started teaching part-time, creative writing for women over 50. Most were beginners, shy with their sentences. But she told them the same thing every week. Write the moment you stayed. Write the moment no one noticed. But it still mattered. They always did. Elena became a fixture in her life. Not a replacement for anything lost, but a companion in the in-between. They walked often, slowly, not always talking. They shared meals and swapped books. They once spent an entire evening making a playlist of songs that reminded them of the people they'd loved and lost. Some nights, they lit a candle and played those songs without speaking, letting the music do what words couldn't. One day, Elena said, "Do you ever feel like you're haunted?" She thought for a moment. "Yes," she said, "but it's not a scary ghost. It's a gentle haunting, like being followed by warmth that hurts a little." Elena nodded. "Me too." The apartment changed gradually. The mattress was finally replaced by a proper bed frame. She boxed up her grandmother's robe, not to throw it out, but to give it rest. She bought new dishes, yellow ones, bright, like sunlight on a cloudy day. And she started writing a book. Not about grief exactly, but about a woman who chose to stay behind when everyone else left. A woman who became invisible and powerful in the same breath, who walked through fire and came out quieter but brighter. A woman who learned to live in the absence as fully as others lived in the light. It wasn't a bestseller. It was barely even finished. But she wrote it anyway, because she had something to say now. Because she knew that care, true care, doesn't need an audience. It changes the world quietly. One breath, one choice, one teaspoon at a time. Months later, she stood by the window of her apartment, tea in hand, watching the trees sway. The seasons were turning again. The leaves were starting to fall. And this time, she didn't feel like the world was slipping away. She felt like she was part of it, not returned to who she was before, because she had no desire to be, but rooted, present, strong in the way only people who have chosen love without reward can be strong. There was a knock at the door. She smiled, crossed the room, and opened it, not afraid of what waited. Not anymore.